The morning heat had already settled over the city when Officer Daniel Mercer stepped into the corner cafe across from the courthouse. The place was small, quiet, and usually filled with office workers trying to avoid attention before the workday began. At the table near the window sat an elderly black woman wearing a pale blue coat and carefully reading a worn paperback book beside a cup of tea. Her name was Evelyn Carter. Most people in town barely noticed her anymore. She moved slowly, spoke softly, and spent most mornings feeding birds in the public square before stopping for tea. But Officer Mercer noticed her immediately, not because she had done anything wrong, but because men like him always searched for someone they believed powerless. He smirked as he approached the counter, loudly complaining about people who didn't belong in respectable neighborhoods. Several customers lowered their eyes. The waitress stiffened nervously. Evelyn quietly continued reading. Mercer grabbed his coffee and deliberately walked toward her table. "You're sitting in my spot," he said coldly. Evelyn looked up calmly and replied, "There are many empty tables, officer." Her politeness irritated him even more. Without warning, he tilted the hot coffee cup, letting the dark liquid spill across her book, coat, and hands. Gasps filled the cafe. Evelyn flinched, but never raised her voice. Mercer laughed under his breath. "Maybe next time you'll learn where you belong." Someone began recording on their phone. Another customer shouted that he had gone too far. But Mercer simply adjusted his badge and walked out, as if humiliating her were part of his morning routine. The waitress rushed over with napkins while Evelyn stared silently at the ruined pages of her book. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, exhaustion. She had lived long enough to recognize hatred when it entered a room. What Mercer did not know was that Evelyn Carter had spent decades sacrificing everything to raise a son who believed justice should protect everyone equally. And only 3 days earlier, that son had officially become the county's new sheriff. Evelyn returned home quietly after the incident, refusing medical attention despite the redness on her hands from the hot coffee. The video from the cafe, however, had already begun spreading online. Within hours, thousands of people watched the clip of Officer Mercer smirking while humiliating an elderly woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Angry comments flooded social media. Some residents demanded Mercer's suspension immediately, while others defended him, claiming the situation was misunderstood. But inside a modest brick house on the edge of town, Sheriff Marcus Carter watched the video in complete silence. He sat frozen at his kitchen table long after the screen went dark. Marcus had spent 20 years in law enforcement believing change could happen slowly from within. He had worked night shifts, survived dangerous operations, and endured racist insults from fellow officers who never thought a black deputy belonged in leadership. Yet through all of it, his mother remained his reason to continue. Evelyn had raised him alone after his father died in a factory accident when Marcus was only 8 years old. She cleaned hotel rooms during the day and worked at a nursing home at night to keep food on the table. Every lesson she taught him centered around dignity. "Never let bitterness become your identity," she used to say. Now, watching the humiliation she endured in silence, Marcus felt something inside him fracture. He drove to her house immediately. When Evelyn opened the door, she tried to smile as though nothing serious had happened. Marcus carefully looked at the burns on her hands and asked why she never called him. Evelyn simply replied, "Because I didn't want your first week as sheriff to begin with anger." Those words hit him harder than the video itself. For years, this town had quietly buried stories like hers. Complaints ignored, abuse dismissed, communities taught to stay silent because speaking up changed nothing. Marcus realized the attack on his mother was not an isolated act. It was the symptom of a deeper disease inside the department he had just inherited. And for the first time in his career, he understood that fixing the system would require more than policies and speeches. It would require confronting people who protected cruelty behind a badge. The next morning, Sheriff Marcus Carter entered department headquarters before sunrise. Officers immediately sensed the tension in the building. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Some deputies avoided eye contact entirely, already aware that the cafe video had exploded across national news overnight. Marcus entered the conference room carrying a thin folder and placed it on the table without saying a word. Officer Mercer sat near the back with crossed arms, still convinced his years on the force would shield him from consequences. He even looked mildly amused. as if the public outrage were temporary entertainment. Marcus finally spoke in a controlled voice that chilled the room more than yelling ever could. This department was created to protect citizens, not humiliate them. Mercer interrupted with a sarcastic laugh. With all due respect, Sheriff, people online don't know the full story. Marcus turned toward him slowly. Then explain it. Mercer hesitated before claiming Evelyn had been disruptive and disrespectful. Several officers shifted uncomfortably because the video clearly proved otherwise. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were years of ignored complaints against Mercer, racial profiling, excessive force accusations, unlawful searches, intimidation reports. Each incident had been buried by supervisors who preferred silence over accountability. Marcus looked around the room. This is what happens when misconduct becomes culture. No one spoke. Some officers stared at the floor, ashamed. Others looked angry that old secrets were surfacing. Marcus announced Mercer's immediate suspension pending criminal investigation. Mercer slammed his chair backward and accused Marcus of targeting him for political attention. But the sheriff's response was immediate. No, I'm targeting behavior that should have ended years ago. Outside the building, reporters gathered as news spread that the new sheriff was reopening multiple internal cases connected to discrimination and abuse. Community members who had stayed silent for decades suddenly began coming forward with their own stories. Elderly residents described being threatened during traffic stops. Young men spoke about humiliating searches with no legal cause. Mothers recalled calling police for help and being treated like criminals themselves. What started with one cup of coffee was becoming something much larger than anyone expected. Marcus understood the danger ahead. Reforming a broken department would make powerful enemies. Yet every time doubt crept into his mind, he remembered his mother sitting quietly in that cafe, refusing to surrender her dignity even while being humiliated. That memory became the force driving everything he did next.